I welcome you to our 137th City Law Breakfast, and let me introduce our President Dean, Anthony Crowell.
Good morning, everyone. How are you today? Good. That's good to hear. It's a beautiful fall morning. We are in full swing here at the law school, and we're really pleased to have you here. I want to give a special shout out to a number of prospective students we have for our two-year honors program who we were lucky enough to have this program coincide with that, and so they're joining us, and I'm always glad when people can see the law school at its best. We're extremely honored this morning to have Bill Bratton here 1 year after his last city law speech, and so much has happened since that time, including his recent retirement from an extraordinary public service career. And certainly whenever Commissioner Bratton speaks, he always deepens our understanding of the challenges and opportunities that confront our city, and I know today will be no different. And I have one message for the Commissioner, and that is simply thank you. In all my years in public service, it's a phrase that I can tell you is seldom heard. So thank you for your invaluable service in one of the most difficult jobs in the world. I also want to acknowledge special guests here today, including our U.S. Marshal for the Eastern District, Charlie Dunn, and Mayor Dinkins was supposed to be here today, but I haven't seen him yet. So hopefully he comes. We call ourselves New York's law school, and there's a big reason for that. It's our close relationship with the city, its agencies, and so many of the public servants who work there who we consider part of our community. And we certainly have a number of students and alumni and friends that serve in uniform here today, and we are grateful for their service. Unfortunately, we're reminded time and again about the life and death risks that they face in their work. And tragically, and I just want to mention this, tragically, just last week we had the worst kind of reminder with the loss of Fire Department Deputy Chief Michael Fahey, who was an inspiring leader at FDNY, a wonderful person, and he was a 1998 graduate of this law school. And during his time here, he displayed extraordinary leadership and devotion that carried on into public service, and he was one of our top students, graduated magna cum laude. He was editor-in-chief of the Law Review and was a Justice Action Fellow here helping immigrant families. So just an extraordinary public servant, and I'd just like to ask you all to offer a moment of silence for Chief Fahey. Thank you very much. Now I'll ask Ross to come up here and begin today's program.
Yeah, we do remember Michael Fahey, and thank you all for, thank you, Anthony, for bringing that to us. Let me say, first I want to welcome everybody to this breakfast. This is the 137th breakfast. On your table are our annual reports and list everyone who's spoken at these breakfasts, and it's really a wonderful list of public servants, and you do get a sense of what goes on here, and we're delighted to share it. Before I begin the introduction, I'd like to thank the sponsors who make it possible for us to have these breakfasts and to keep them open to the public and free. The law firm of Greenberg Traurig and Ed Wallace is here. Thank you so much for you and your firm. Con Edison has been another founding sponsor from the very beginning, and Verizon as well. I'd also like to thank those of you with gold stars on your badges. You have voluntarily contributed to support these breakfasts, and we really thank you for that. I'd also like to thank the people at the Center for New York City Law who work so hard to keep these breakfasts as elegant and nice as they are. Brian Kasuba, the Associate Director, Lillian Valle Santiago, Jesse Deno, and Jonathan Sizemore. And there are many others at the law school that make this accommodation as lovely as it is. Bill Bratton, of course, is maybe one of the most famous people in the world today with the successes that he has had in the 2 terms as police commissioner here in New York City. His career is very well known. I thought rather than a typical introduction, I went back to his book, his Turnaround, and very interesting read about a life of somebody who both has the ambition and skills to bring tremendous leadership to law enforcement and to urban issues. Back in 1986, he was appointed as a superintendent of a police force in Massachusetts, the Metropolitan District Commission. He was a superintendent. We found it to be with dilapidated equipment, demoralized police force, and he took it over, and he decided that what was important was to have a plan and state a mission. And in his book, he sets out the mission, and I'd like to read you some of the portions of what he said was the mission in 1986 when he took over this demoralized police force in Massachusetts. The police department exists to protect and serve the public. The department and its members will maintain the highest ethical standards of conduct. We will treat all citizens with dignity, respect, and courtesy. We will safeguard each citizen's right to free expression, movement, and constitutional liberty. We will use only minimum necessary force when performing our lawful duties. We are committed to creating an environment that is productive and satisfying and of which its members can be proud. I think it's safe to say that that mission statement of 1986 has been in many ways the mission statement of Bill Bratton for the next 30 years. And we thank him for it, and we're honored to have him come to the podium at New York Law School.
Boy, did that bring back memories, and you got pretty deep into that book. It's great to be here once again. It was just about a year ago when, as the police commissioner, I came to update this audience on the state of the NYPD and the state of the city of New York. I'm very pleased now in my new capacity as a citizen of New York, no longer having law enforcement responsibilities, to report that the state of the city, as evidenced earlier this week in the press conference with the mayor and the new commissioner, Jimmy O'Neill, where they reported that September just passed was the safest September in the city's history since keeping records in modern times. And my prediction is that at the end of this year, we will probably be reporting, or they will be reporting, much to the delight, hopefully, of all of us, that this may, in fact, be the safest year in the history of the city, going back to the 60s, in terms of reported crime. And that's good news for all of us. What I'd like to do with you today is talk about the last 50 years in not only the city, but this country, and in the profession that I was so proud to be part of for most of those 50 years, and that's the profession of policing, the practice of policing. Looking at this room, I'm pleased to see that there are many generations represented here. Pleased to see so many students from the school here also who are new to some of what I'll be talking about, but of experiencing what I believe are the results of that progression, that evolution of the American police profession over the last 50 years, and the benefits that we are feeling from that advancement, as well as some of the unintended consequences, some of them negative, which we are still wrestling with and dealing with. Had the good pleasure of saying hello this morning to Herb Sturz. Herb, I had the opportunity to meet in my first time here in New York in 1990, but had heard of him through the years. And so Herb has been on that long march also, that progression of this city from its fall into the abyss in the 70s and 80s, and it's climbing out of the abyss to a position where it can rightfully claim to be the safest large city in America, and I would argue probably one of the safest large cities in the world. And it's something that didn't just happen. It took a lot of collaboration, a lot of partnership, private sector, public sector, government leadership, community leadership, police leadership. It was a collaborative effort, and we continue to collaborate going forward. The comment that was just made with my introduction, I thank you for that introduction, that those terms were in some respects paraphrasing my personal hero in the profession of policing. That's Sir Robert Peel. Sir Robert Peel in 1829 was charged with the mission of creating in the City of London the first metropolitan police department of any significance in any major city in what was then the emerging democracies of the world, and created the British Metropolitan Police, the London Metropolitan Police, The term Bobby was a term of affection for Bobby Peel's police officers, and they were called peelers or bobbies. Peelers because they used to carry around a little clatter that they would, many of you remember as kids, you had that little thing, you twirled them on and it made that funny clattering noise. Well, the police officers of those days, to notify each other of troubles, used those, and they used whistles. But his most significant contribution, apart from creating that still extraordinary police department, were 9 principles of policing. And they have been my Bible going back to the 1970s when I was first exposed as a young sergeant, attending a meeting at which the then police commissioner of the Metropolitan Police was visiting Boston, my hometown, the Boston Police Department. And I was a rising young star at that time in the Boston Police and was invited to a reception at which he was speaking. And he talked about Sir Robert Peel's 9 principles. And those 9 principles, I'm going to base my comments on them. Number 1, the basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent crime and disorder. I emphasize the prevention. I emphasize the connection between crime and disorder, because that early exposure to those philosophies, and I encourage that you read those 9, they're even more appropriate today to policing than they were back in 1829, that they formed the bases of my life in policing, both through the experiences I was having as a young police officer, sergeant, lieutenant, superintendent, chief of several departments, moving then into the New York experience in 1990 as chief of transit, back to Boston as police commissioner of the first department I joined, 94 back as police commissioner, a dream that I had for almost 20 some odd years. And my wife has a book, Fairy Tales Can't Come True. Well, dreams can't come true, and I'm the living embodiment of it. And sometimes it comes true several times. And the fact that I had the experience not recently for 3 more years to be commissioner for the second time, I'm a very fortunate individual indeed, because dreams did come true for me. And hopefully those dreams, those visions, those goals, that mission provided the fulfillment of a lot of other dreams. Hopefully for 8.5 million people now living in the city, 7.5 million back in 1990 when I first came, that mission, that goal to achieve crime reduction, to achieve improved status for the police profession, hopefully I did play a role in that. And while I'm now out of that profession, hopefully some of the foundations, similar to what Sir Robert Peel created in 1829, some of those evolutionary changes, and indeed revolutionary changes I'll talk about over these last 50 years that I participated in, will continue to shape and form American policing, and indeed international policing, as we go forward into the 21st century. And speaking of the 21st century, I oftentimes start my remarks by using a Chinese expression I'm very fond of. May you live in interesting times. Like many Chinese expressions, it has 2 meanings. It can be a curse, or it can be a blessing. At the moment, I think, as we look at our national election and all that's going on around the world, that it's a toss-up. We're going to have to wait and see. And in any event, that life, particularly in policing, during the 50 years that I've been exposed to it, has always been interesting in good times and in bad. And so let's talk about my evolution in the police profession and how we got to where we are today, which I think, despite all the controversy in the country at this time, that is so much in the front pages of our newspapers and leading the newscast very often around the issues of race and police powers and use of authority, abuse of authority, that it reminds me very much of the expression deja vu all over again, Yogi Bear. The idea that when I came into policing in 1970, October 7th, one day after my 23rd birthday, just back from the Vietnam War, this country, and looking around this room, most of you weren't even born then. This country, if we think we have it tough now, that basically 1970 was an extraordinary beginning of an extraordinary decade, particularly in my city, Boston. That Boston was the epicenter in many respects of all the turmoil that came out of the 60s, the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the liberalization of our society, the demand for change. And no profession was more profoundly impacted by the 60s than the American police profession going into the 70s. And as I went into the Boston Police Academy on October 7th, I can still very vividly remember Captain Hogan, the lead instructor of the academy. One of our first classes was on this recent Supreme Court decision, 1968, Terry versus Ohio. The bases of what has consumed so much of the attention of this city for the last number of years, more commonly known as stop, question, and frisk, more commonly known as stop and frisk. We usually forget the question portion of it. And it is about the idea that the Supreme Court, in that very famous decision, established the guidelines for police in terms of reasonable suspicion stops. I referenced that talking about everything old is new again, that here we are 48 years after that very famous decision, still discussing it, still misinterpreting it, as evidenced by the recent presidential debate by both the moderator as well as both of the candidates, that it is an issue that is one of great confusion to people in terms of what we can or we cannot do. So I give that as a way of example to talk about what I, as a young police officer, experienced in 1970 coming into the police academy. I still remember Captain Hogan holding up his hand. Remember the hand, boys, remember the hand. And the reason he talked about the hand is he discussed stop, question, frisk. He talked about 5 elements of it that a police officer would need to know to be able to start putting this new constitutional guideline into effect. It was also a time of great change, the Escobedo decision, the Miranda decision, the exclusionary rule decision, the idea that the police abuses that had accumulated in the 40s, 50s, and 60s were now being addressed by the highest court in the land and were going to profoundly change police training, practices, policies, and guidelines. Similarly, some of the abuses of police, the misapplication of law, misunderstanding of law, misappropriation, if you will, of power and authority, is at the heart and soul of some of the debates that we're engaged in at this time, almost 50 years after those profound court decisions of the 1960s. But coming into policing in the 1970s, I started off walking a beat, no radio. To get contacted, to get calls, or to get assistance, I'd have to go to a call box, open it with my key, and basically on a 1920 style phone with an earpiece and a mouthpiece, lean my head in the door and hope somebody didn't slam the door on me while I was leaning into that call box. And that's how you basically communicated back to the police station, police precinct. But during my first year in the Boston Police Department, the department, like many American police departments, began one of the profound changes that has reshaped American policing, and for the good in some respects and not for the good, the mobilization of policing. Within a year, almost all Boston police officers were now assigned 2 officers to a cop. We went from walking a beat, intimacy to a beat, to going into police cars where there's going to be more mobility, the ability to get to calls coming in through the new 911 systems faster, that this was going to be modern and professional policing because society was demanding that police professionalize in the 1970s. But one of the things that society, government, communities all were demanding at that time were that police improve their response to crime. Response, not prevention, because we did not understand that as we come out of the 60s, that there was a great belief by our society, our government leadership, that crime was something that police could only respond to, that it was believed that there were causes of crime that the police could have no direct impact on, and that belief propelled policing for most of the next 20 years to focus on response, not prevention. So we began to violate the basic tenet of the Sir Robert Peel, that the basic mission for which we exist is the prevention of crime. And as we began to focus on response, measuring response time to 911 calls, measuring the number of arrests we make, how many crimes did we clear, improving forensics, improving training, all with a focus on responding to crime, we began to move away from accepting any responsibility for the prevention of crime, a total rejection of the Sir Robert Peel philosophy. And that was the world I was being introduced into. Society did really believe that the causes of crime then were racism, poverty, the economy, weather, many, many things that were the cause of crime. And I believe they were wrong, and I believe over the next 20 years we proved they were wrong to the extent that in 1990, American policing returned to the basic tenets of Sir Robert Peel, focusing once again on the prevention of crime. But let me take you through the 70s and 80s to get you to 1990, a profound year in American policing and in our country's history. Profound year because 1990, as a result of all that was happening in the 70s and 80s, ended up being the worst crime year in the history of our country and in the history of this city. The buildup of a misapplied focus of police to responding to crime rather than the focus on the prevention of it. My experience in Boston, young police officer, 4.5 years. 1975, I'm promoted to sergeant, youngest sergeant promoted in the history of the Boston Police Department. The result of changing the promotional system by a profound change agent, transformational change agent, police commissioner called Bob DeGrazia, a role model for me, the idea that one man, one person, could make a profound difference in a profession that I was ready to leave the city of Boston by the mid-1970s because of the corruption, because of all that I was seeing in terms of the inefficiency, the profession that I had sought to become part of since I was a young child, that the reality was not satisfying to me. But DeGrazia began to change that, began to professionalize the Boston Police Department in tremendous ways. And I was a direct beneficiary of that, to be able to take promotional processes that weren't based just on the law and seniority. The average age of a sergeant in that time was in the 50s in the Boston Police Department, that he changed it so that the books we read were the Kerner Report coming out of the civil rights issues of the 1960s. We read the ABA report on race relations in America. We read Wisenhand and Iannone on management and supervision of police. That we read the Constitution for our promotional exam. And I came in number one on that. And that's began what, by all accounts, was a meteoric rise in the Boston Police Department and the American police profession, 1975. 1977, I was asked to go into the District 4 precinct of Boston that policed the South End, the Back Bay, and the Fenway areas of Boston. All of those areas now, basically, I wish I had the money to buy some of those burned out brownstones back then. I wouldn't be standing here in front of you. I'd be on a beach somewhere. But back then, those areas, you go to Boston now, and they're gorgeous. But back then, they were the highest crime neighborhoods in the city of Boston in many respects. And I was asked to basically be the police sergeant assigned to a new neighborhood initiative called the Boston Fenway Program, created by Claire Cotton and supported by 22 institutions in that area: Northeastern University, Wentworth, Boston State College, Museum of Fine Arts, the entities that were in dire straits because they could not attract students, they could not attract patrons, the Boston Symphony, because of the growing crime problem in that very distressed neighborhood. And they were looking for new ways to try and address the crime, the disorder, the decay, the malaise. And that was a turning point in my life, because I went from being a police officer in the streets, being a sergeant for a period of time in South Boston, and I'll reference that in a moment, and then going up to the police commissioner's staff to work for Bob DeGrazia. And Boston of the 1970s was an extraordinary place. Talk about interesting times. All that was going on in our society in terms of all those changes, the Civil Rights Act, and so many of the other things that the country was going through. Boston had its own set of issues around desegregation. One of the most segregated of the northern cities, school system totally segregated, housing totally segregated. And through the 70s, that Boston became a place of incredible turbulence as the federal courts mandated desegregation. And I can still remember vividly, as a young police officer, a young sergeant, a young lieutenant, and a young superintendent, youngest in the history of the department, policing those events. Incredibly chaotic times. A marvelous book by Anthony Lucas, Common Ground, a term I use all the time, talks about that era of incredible chaos, but incredible movement also to right the wrong of hundreds of years of segregation. But it was a phenomenal learning experience for me about the issues of race that even today, 50 years later, are still at the heart of so much of the turmoil that we're experiencing as we are still trying to right the wrongs that began 400 years ago, the original sin, as we call it, and the issues of trying to deal with the issues that affected slavery. Now, if any of them spill over into the issues of immigration. So I had a birthing experience in policing, if you will, of extraordinary proportions that shaped me profoundly for the rest of my policing career. And a major portion of that was, as that young sergeant, and subsequently promoted to lieutenant, I went in as the neighborhood coordinator into District 4, working for an extraordinary captain and deputy superintendent, a couple of old-timers, but they were old-timers who basically had seen the light, and they understood that policing needed to change, and they were willing to change. And they were willing to work with this young sergeant coming out of the commissioner's office. And I was a bit of a whiz kid back in those days. Computers were just coming into being, those big old green sheets that used to be about 3 feet across with reams of information. And so even back then, I understood the importance of data. The importance of data, of identifying where were the problems, where were the issues that we needed to deal with, taking huge amounts of information and reducing it to manageable forms. And as I went into that District 4, my challenge was to create community policing, as we came to call it in 1990. But back then, we called it neighborhood policing. Term sound familiar? You're going to hear a lot about neighborhood policing in New York City in 2016. Chief Commissioner O'Neill is now embodying the basic principles that began back in the 1970s in District 4 in Boston. And I would set up community meetings, first time they had ever been held in the city of Boston. And I put up posters in the barber shops and in the churches, come to a community meeting to meet your police. And I would take the sector car officers who were assigned to that area, bring them to that meeting, and I'd have all my statistics, and we got great turnout because people were scared. These neighborhoods were deteriorating, crime was going up. But what I found when I would go to meeting after meeting after meeting, we documented these meetings, I still have the original books, the matrices we developed, was there I was all set to talk about crime, murders, rapes, robberies, so commonplace, front pages of many of the newspapers of the time. But most of the people in those audiences didn't want to talk about that. They wanted to talk about other things. And those other things they wanted to talk about were what we now know as quality of life, or the term broken windows as referenced in the Atlantic 1982 article by George Kelly and Jim Wilson. Well, 5 years before that article came out and that term broken windows was applied to quality of life policing, I was living it. I was hearing it. And it was a profound discovery for me because most cops focus on serious crime. And that minor crime was something in the 70s we began moving away from enforcing. We weren't dealing with it. And indeed, most American police departments well into the 90s didn't deal with it. And there was the violation of the basic tenet and understanding of Sir Robert Peel in 1829. The basic mission for which the police exist is to prevent crime and disorder. The two are linked. I strongly believe that. I passionately believe it. And beginning in the 1970s, I began, through my rise in American policing, to ensure that everywhere I went, that we focused not only on the serious crime, but that we focused on the so-called quality of life crime or the broken windows, as it's been more commonly called in recent years. Because what we failed to understand in the 70s was that these so-called victimless crimes, the prostitution, gang on the corner, the drinking in public, the public urination, that the abandoned cars, the graffiti, that there was a victim, and the victim was the neighborhood and all the people who lived in that neighborhood and would see quality of life deteriorate, coming down their doorstep in the morning and having to step over the condom left by the prostitute the night before, being kept up all night by the gang on the corner, or seeing their front doorstep sprayed with graffiti, or as they walked to work to get on the bus or the subway, seeing somebody basically brazenly publicly urinating on their streets. And they asked, what are the police doing about it? And the reality was, increasingly, we were doing less and less about it. Because during the 70s and 80s, American police forces shrunk rapidly in strength, but were responding to the prioritization of dealing with serious crime and responding to it. Not understanding the link of the minor crime left undeterred would eventually embolden those to create more significant crime in many instances. So as I moved in through the 70s and 80s through a series of police departments in Boston, police commissioner, superintendent-in-chief, 1980, 82, 83, 80, chief of the MBTA Transit Police, 86, the police department that was referenced in the introduction, and then 1990, the epiphany, coming to New York City, Transit Police, Subways of New York, 1990, a watershed year. Coming to New York for the first time in many years, that New York was the manifestation of that decline in quality of life. It could be the poster boy for America at that time. And those of you who are old enough to remember 1990 in New York, or the years just preceding it, remember what this city looked like. A lot of you sitting here now, students going to this school, have no recollection of that period. Your world is the world of relevance of today. The New York City of today is a very, very different place, physically and in many other ways, than that of 1990, particularly the subways. 6 million riders a day back in New York, with a population of 7.5 million at that time, 3.5 million, with ridership declining. Subway system was a mess. Bob Kiley, the recently deceased, a great innovative and leader in turning that system around, focused on not only one, when I was hired, issue of serious crime, of which there was some 50 or 60 reported a day in a large system. Today it's averaging 5 or 6 reported crimes a day with almost double the ridership. But what was seen every day was a phenomenal deterioration of quality of life below ground. Because the transit police, then a separate police department from the City of New York Police Department, and there was also a separate housing police, were not focusing on quality of life. To make a single arrest for a fare evader back in 1990, a police officer could basically spend almost 24 hours processing that single arrest off the system and sitting for hours upon hours in the court system that eventually was sued to reduce the wait time for processing of arrests to require that a person be processed in under 24 hours. But the department was not focused on basically dealing with the minor crime of fare evasion, urination, homeless, almost 5,000 homeless living in the subways, including about 500 living in the tunnels, the most desperate of the desperate, deep in the bowels of the tunnel, the most drug addicted, the most emotionally disturbed, that in every year would lose about 120 to 130 people who died in the subway system, independent of the murders. Back then, about 20 murders a year in a city that had over 2,000. Now we have, on average, about 1 murder a year in a subway population twice the size. So 1990 was a watershed year in American policing in that we began to turn the corner in appreciating that the policing of the 70s and 80s, focusing on response, focusing on primarily developing response to serious crime, was failing. Historic high crime numbers. This city, 1990, 2,243 murders, over 100,000 burglaries, 110,000 stolen cars, 100,000 robberies, tens upon thousands of rapes. The city and the country were a mess. Highest crime rate year, or close to the highest crime rate year in the history of the country. But in 1990, we embraced a form of policing called community policing. And I was one of the leaders of that effort. Because community policing returned policing to the basic tenets of Sir Robert Teal. The 3 elements of it that I emphasize, my wife is a criminal defense attorney, former prosecutor, now legal analyst for CBS News. She always says that in presenting to a jury, you want to keep things to no more than 3 ideas or concepts. You're going to lose them on the 4th. So I've always thought of that as I give speeches and put things together. And so I describe community policing in very simple terms, the 3 Ps. P1, partnership. Police, community, political leadership, trying to as great a degree as possible find common ground, collaboration. So the force multiplier of all of us working together would help us to deal with the second P, problems, the identification of problems and how to prioritize them. We are a city of neighborhoods, and the policing initiative that Commissioner O'Neill is now moving forward with is recognizing those neighborhoods, reconfiguring precincts to as great a degree as possible, configure the largest neighborhoods in those precincts. Instead of having 17 or 18 sectors, having 4 or 5. Why? So that we can try to prioritize within that area what are the problems that the community wants addressed. And as you know, no two neighborhoods are alike. You can walk 5 blocks up the street here, and you're going to be in a totally different world than the one we're standing in right now. And the issues are different. Some neighborhoods want quality of life enforcement. Some neighborhoods want crime dealt with because that's their experience. So policing had to move in a direction where it could find a way to, instead of just being a monolithic entity trying to do the same thing everywhere, and that was the 9/11 system, try to improve response time everywhere, just didn't work. 911 gobbled up police resources, declining resources in the 70s and 80s. So in 1990, the embrace of community policing, partnership, focus on collaborative problem identification and solving, and what was the third P? Prevention. Policing and political and public support and its embrace of community policing in the 90s returned it to 1829. Everything old is new again. So the lessons I began to understand in the 70s, and basically through my experiences in the 80s through a series of police departments, I brought with me to New York in 1990. And what happened in the subways of New York in 1990, 91, that were not happening on the streets of New York and were not happening in the country? Crime went down, first time in 25 years, and went down significantly. It went down so much that people actually noticed. Fare evasion, which was averaging about 250,000 events a day in a riding population of a little over 3 million. Malcolm Gladwell's Tipping Point, the article in New Yorker that then became the famous best-selling book, was based on his observation that where'd all the fare evaders go? One day they seemed like they were there, the next day they were gone. Well, it took a little longer than that, but what we began to do was to find ways to enforce fare evasion. Because while it was a minor crime, $1.15 theft of service back then, a lot cheaper ride than it is today, but multiply that by 250,000 a day, an $80 million loss to a system that desperately needed that money. It was also a challenge to police in terms of how to enforce that problem because they didn't want to enforce it. It was minor crime. They wanted to focus on the big things. Well, the problem with 4,000 cops, I had about 50 crimes a day to focus on. But what were people most afraid of was what they were seeing every day. The aggressive begging, the homeless population, cardboard cities all over the place, decaying stations, subway token robberies. So we began to correct that. In 1992, I went back to Boston, subsequently became commissioner of that city in 1993. But then we had an election in 1993 that basically Rudy Giuliani came in as mayor, succeeding Mayor Dinkins. One of Mayor Dinkins' incredible legacies for this city will be against all great odds in the early 90s in response to the crime crises in the subway system that was beginning to be addressed, but in the streets of the city that were starting to see crime go down, but not so that anybody really noticed. He hired 6,000 more cops, safe streets, safe cities. And those 6,000 cops were the necessary infusion of medicine to deal with a very ill patient. And the idea was to properly apply that medicine to the issues. In 94, when I came back as police commissioner, the issues we applied it to were 8. And they were the 8 strategies of concern at that time. Policing is like the practice of medicine. We both have the basic mission to the best of our ability, do no harm as we practice. You ever notice the term? You practice law. I practice policing. Doctors practice medicine. Why? Because we're always learning. We're always trying to make it better. But we understand that we're a long way from arriving at the perfect solution. But in the practice, as we try to perfect, to do as little harm as possible. And in the world of policing, like medicine in particular, or the world of law that many of you practice, we can have profound effects on our patients' lives if we don't do it appropriately. So in policing, for a police commissioner, police chief, police superintendent, like a physician, each patient, each city, each neighborhood, each precinct is different. And each one requires, for their particular illnesses, particular medicines in the right amount. And I'll talk in a few moments about the stop, question, frisk issue that has roiled this city and indeed the country for so many years in that term of dealing with it as if you were a doctor dealing with a patient with significant illnesses. But in 94, what we were focusing on was drugs, youth crime, guns, the plagues that had grown significantly in the 70s and 80s that had led to the worst crime year. They were all linked. We also focused on police corruption, significant problems with that in the early 90s around the issue of drugs and dealing with it. We were also dealing with the issue of car thefts, 110,000 of them. They're now down, I think, this year to about 7,000 or 8,000, a huge drop. The overall drop in crime in the city is almost 80% overall. But back at that era, it had been growing, and where there were some decreases, nobody had really noticed because they're insignificant. But the 8 strategies that we put into place were like the, if you will, the rungs on a wheel, a wagon wheel. They were intended to all support each other. And the support that they were going forward with was the idea that police were taking responsibility for the prevention of crime while improving our response to crime. And to ensure that we were in fact doing it correctly, we developed CompStat, the now world-famous system of CompStat that was intended to use data to focus our attention on emerging problems and patterns when they were 2 or 3 before they became 20 or 30. You go to a doctor, you're not feeling well, you want him to do a quick analysis of you, rapidly respond with effective tactics, the right amount of medicine, and when you get better, he wants you to come back for a checkup every once in a while. Well, that's what we created in policing in the 1990s and led the way here in New York City with CompStat. Gather crime information every day. Rapidly respond to those emerging patterns, trends, and hotspots. Use effective tactics, plainclothes, uniform, task forces. Use precision. And then relentlessly follow up to make sure that it's not starting to emerge, even though you have the satisfaction that you think you solved it. So all that was churning in the 1990s. And as we continue through that period of time, the increased resources, new precision focus, CompStat, technology, forensics, DNA came into being, which helped significantly in the solving of cases, that the city, the country, continued to get safer, to the extent that by the time we moved into the 21st century, overall violent crime, overall minor crimes, if you will, property crimes, were down significantly, 30 and 40% across the country. In our great city, down over 50%. While it's often talked about, nobody knows what happened, why crime could go down so dramatically. In our city, I believe it was 1, the police. 2, I believe it was the partnerships we had. 3, I believe it was the focus that we put on that problem through a succession of mayors, a succession of police commissioners, and a succession of communities that wanted something done about crime and disorder. But as we come into the 21st century, the world changed dramatically with 9/11. The role of police needed to expand to also now deal with terrorism, and no more so than here in New York City. But the traditional crime and disorder still needed to be addressed. And during the period of time, 2001, 2002, moving up to now 2016, profound changes were occurring in the NYPD that were going to have incredible impact up until this point in time, 2016. And let me speak to that because this goes to the issue of stop, question, and frisk. We talked about the 70s and 80s, moving away from the prevention focus, moving away from the focus at all on quality of life, returning to that in the 1990s, and I'll speak specifically about my experiences as commissioner and chief, but in America they were mirroring somewhat what we were doing in New York, but in New York I think we were applying it more assertively and more successfully just based on the significant reductions in crime we had that surpassed just about any other city in America. But as we turned the corner into the 21st century, several things were happening after 9/11. The size of the police force was shrinking dramatically. The growth that David Dinkins had initiated that had helped to give adequate medicine and resources to deal with the crime problem of the 90s, that problem was down about 50, 60%, rounding the corner in the 21st century. As the city began to move into the economic crises of 2007, 2008, Bloomberg administration, in response to now very significant stress on taxes, et cetera, began to reduce city government and very quietly began to reduce the size of the New York City police force to the extent that I don't think anybody noticed. 6,000 fewer police officers. That's an average of about 80 fewer police officers in every precinct in the city. And why you didn't notice was that crime overall continued to go down. A couple of aberrant years went up a few percentage points, but within overall crime, robberies went down, murders went down, so that there was a sense that the city was continued to get safer. But the loss of those police officers was not felt by the public. And one of the reasons it was not was that Commissioner Kelly, that understanding that he still had significant crime problems in many precincts of the city, 15 or 20, they're still having the same problems in the same precincts. areas that are desperate with poverty, desperate with economic deprivation, desperate with decades-long issues, that crime was still occurring way out of proportion of other areas of the city. So we developed what was basically the same system that General Petraeus was applauded for in Iraq, the surge. Twice a year, academy classes would graduate, 1,200, 1,500 officers, and those most newly trained but least experienced officers would be sent out into those 10 or 15 most troubled precincts. And officers, platoons of them, 12, 15 officers with one sergeant trying to supervise, were put on largely walking beats out in those neighborhoods. The idea was through their presence, one, deter crime, but they were, like the department itself, being continually pushed for activity, measurable activity, believing that that activity in and of itself would help to keep the crime rate going down and keep the population of the city feeling comfortable that crime was under control. It had, however, the unintended consequence that poorly supervised, in some respects poorly trained officers, particularly on the issue of stop, question, frisk, Terry versus Ohio, reasonable suspicion stops, all the various names that it's been given over time, that there was a phenomenal acceleration, particularly since the department has begun documenting stop, question, and frisk stops back in, I think, the late 90s, so that there was an ability to track, like other things the department was keeping track of, the number of stops. But that in and of itself created an unintended consequence by pushing for the documentation of the stops, that the belief that those stops were in fact keeping crime down, then it began to become a measured entity in CompStat. And by being measured in CompStat, precinct commanders, sergeants would be pushing officers for more and more activity in that category. And over time, we saw a phenomenal growth, even as crime continued to go down, in the number of stops. Going back to my medical analogy, doctor, the patient. Patient's getting better. We put the right amount of chemo, put the right amount of radiation, some surgery. He's getting better. But the doctor decides, well, that seemed to work. Let me try more. Gives more chemo, more radiation. As we know, chemo and radiation, if not controlled, are going to kill you. If used with precision, if used in the right amount, they will, in fact, in many instances, cure you of your cancer. But if inappropriately applied in terms of too much overdose, you're going to make the patient sicker. And so what did we begin to see happening in that period of time up to 2010, 11? The patient, particularly those people living in those 10 or 15 precincts, the most distressed neighborhoods of the city, largely minority, largely African American, or in the case of New York, because we have such a diverse black population, we have Caribbean blacks, we have African blacks, we have African Americans, that the patients started protesting, doctor, I'm getting better, but you keep giving me all this medicine, all these stops. But it fell on deaf ears. Until around 2012, and then the city began quietly pulling back on demanding the stops. So that when the Floyd decision came down, it was too late. The judge in that decision found that stop, question, frisk, reasonable suspicion stops, didn't say anything. It basically reaffirmed their constitutionality. It is a constitutionally authorized and guided tenet, the basic tenet, the basic tool of policing. But the way that the NYPD was implementing it, the way the NYPD was practicing it, she found to be discriminatory, to be unconstitutional. And so we ended up with the situation that in 2013, the mayoral campaign revolved largely around that issue. Mayor de Blasio is elected. I'm now appointed as his new commissioner. I'm the new doctor looking at the same patient. And my diagnosis was the patient needed a lot less medicine, particularly stop, question, and frisk. So we went from, when I came through the door in 2014, hundreds of thousands. This year, I think the department will probably do about 24,000 documented stops where they document it much more carefully. In a city that has 500,000 more people than we had back in the turn of the century. And you know what? Crime has continued to go down. As reported on this past Monday by Commissioner O'Neill, crime continues to go down, as it did in 2014, as it did in 2015, as it did in 2016. So in sum and substance, the point I'm making is that the profession of policing, like the practice of medicine, the practice of law, is continually evolving. And in that evolution, we're going to make some mistakes, some awful mistakes, but you learn from the mistakes, and you try to then reposition yourself. So I would hope that both this city, this country, have learned from the idea of watching very closely and measuring as intimately as you can the patient, so that we are true to the admonition to do no harm. Because as we clearly saw, that some of the practices and procedures in policing, of the law, the criminal justice system, and the current attacks that seemingly besieging the police profession today, similar to the attacks on the police profession in the 1960s and 70s when I came into the business, that many of them are justified. And they need to be addressed and can be addressed. But the way to address them is, in fact, to try to find that common ground, that collaboration. And so my expectation is for this city, and indeed for this country, over the next several years, we will find that common ground. Will it be easy? Probably not. Will it be cantankerous in many respects? Probably will. Democracy in many respects, I forget who talked about it's like watching sausage being made. We're constantly churning. But I believe that in that churning that we are turning. And I think we are turning in the right direction. That's what democracy is all about healthy debate, about the ability to disagree, to have dialogue, but then to try to find common ground. And I think the common ground we have found is that we need to, one, do a better job of clarifying what we're talking about. And as evidenced by the recent presidential debate, a lot of people don't know what the hell they're talking about when it comes to this subject. And the misinformation, the obfuscation, the deliberate untruthfulness to make political points or to make gains by advocates, it just makes it much more difficult. So I ended my police career 3 weeks ago as I began it, an optimist. And over those now 46 years, there were times of pessimism, but fortunately the optimism always overrode that. So as I look back to where we were in 1970 and where we are in 2016, there has been a sea change, and a sea change largely for the better, not without certain significant issues, some of which is continuing to be addressed, need to be addressed, but that the profession is in fact a very different one than it was in the 70s, because back then it was not even a profession. It had none of the tenets of a profession. Today it has all of those. It has a body of knowledge, it has leadership, it has practices, procedures, policies, so much more than we had to work with back then. So I'll close as I began. May we live in interesting times, but may we look at them from the idea of wishing you the best of times rather than, as some would, wish us the worst of times. Thank you for this opportunity to once again be here this morning. Any questions? Thank you. Q&A?
You want to keep going? Well, let me just say about these events, one of the things that we like about them is we give our speakers an opportunity to tell a full story. This is not a soundbite opportunity. And what you heard was a really full and wonderful and intelligent discussion of one of the central issues of our time. I want to thank our special sponsor, Tonio Burgos and Associates. We invite special sponsors to help us finance these breakfasts, and I want to thank you so much for doing that. We do have an opportunity for questions, okay, well, go to the microphones, and let's start on this side right here, and then we go back and forth. I'm not sure how long we'll continue, but because we usually like to end at 9:30, but we will take questions.
Again, he runs a hard and fast 9:30 stop that, so if you need to leave, have made your appointments based on that stop. But I am available it's 25 past now, so why don't we figure at least 10 or 15 minutes that if there are questions that I might be able to respond to. To the right and then to the left. Please, young lady.
You spoke a lot about a nuanced approach to policing itself and that you have to respond neighborhood by neighborhood to what different communities need. How do you also have a nuanced approach to incentivizing individual officers to be meeting the needs of their neighborhoods and to use community policing to guide incentive structures within the police department?
That's a great question, because it's one of the benefits in policing is that to get to be a leader in policing, you have to start at the bottom. There are, almost without exception, if you're leading an American police department, large or small, you began as a police officer. So you have the relevant experience of what it's like to be a cop. In my case, coming out of the police academy, after 6 weeks of training, 6 weeks, 155-pound Billy Bratton, working in an all-black neighborhood that 2 years before had been an all-white neighborhood, but with real estate and banks basically redlining and pushing out the whites and basically encouraging, in this case, African Americans to come in. That was my beginning of experience. And one of the things I think I've been very good at in my career as a police leader is always keeping in mind the men and women that I lead and how to motivate them. And one of the ways you want to motivate them is to give them opportunity. So what we've tried to do, myself and now Commissioner Jimmy O'Neill over these last 3 years in this city, is to give New York City police officers opportunities different than they had in the past. Not only the quality of the training that they're receiving now in the police academy. Next police academy class is going to be a total 21st century tech class. They're going to work off a laptop computer. They won't be lugging body bags around with 22 different books that they have to master in their 6 months. So for the millennial generation, they're used to working with computers and iPads, and so the learning experience is a better experience for them. But for the average cop on the street, that in terms of the frustrations they feel, just chasing call to call, never having a chance to work on problems, a lot of my understanding of that goes back to my frustration when I was a young cop, that I'd see all those burglary reports and could do nothing about them. But I remember a captain gave me and another young officer a chance to work plainclothes, to identify the pattern, identify when those burglaries were occurring, and we got to work in that area and caught the guy. The great satisfaction of being allowed to in a sense, innovate, to be creative. The new neighborhood policing model that Jimmy is creating here, I'm going to have to get out of the habit of calling him Jimmy. He's the police commissioner now. But is the very similar model to what I had back in the 70s in Boston. When we designed the neighborhood policing program back then, I needed officers who would volunteer to work in the neighborhoods, in the sectors. But I also needed officers that would chase the 911 calls. Fortunately, in asking for volunteers, what I committed to them is, I will not take you out of your neighborhood, out of your sector, to chase calls in other sectors. I will use the other group of officers who want to be able to police the whole district, want to chase the calls. I'll use them to do that to the greatest degree possible. So we ended up starting an initiative where cops got to choose how they would police. A lot of the cops wanted to be in the same neighborhood every day. They wanted to know the people. They wanted to, that's what motivated them. Others, including myself, if I was a young cop back then, I would have wanted to have been in the, what we called emergency response cars, because you had more opportunity to run around with the red lights and sirens. It was more exciting. But a lot of the older cops who basically had gotten that out of their blood, they wanted another experience. And so what we're doing with the neighborhood policing program here is neighborhood coordinating officers, all volunteers, all who get 3 weeks of training on how to interact with the community, to partner, to problem solve. And then they basically work with approximately 12 officers who are assigned to their sector around the clock. And then they work with the other officers who are assigned to the whole precinct. So that there's a 3-tier approach, plus it's aided by the community affairs officers who have been there for many, many years, the people you see in the light blue shirts all the time at events and demonstrations. So we're trying to find a way to motivate the cops. Additionally, we've created a lot of volunteer units the last 2 years. The Critical Response Command to fight terrorism, the 550 officers there, all volunteers, constantly training. They train every day, every shift to deal with terrorist-related issues. The 800 Strategic Response Group, the group that will deal with demonstrations, all volunteers, training all the time, especially equipped. Those 800 officers, you're going to start seeing a lot more of them riding around on bicycles, for example, dealing with demonstrations. So think of the thousands of New York City police officers who over the past year or two are being given the opportunity to do what they think they would like to do, what they think they're good at. And so a lot of it is to try to find ways within the requirements of policing to keep your people motivated, to keep them stimulated, to keep them creative. And the creativity aspect is what you want. You want them to, I might be smart as hell, but I surround myself with people that are a lot smarter than me, and the collective grouping basically comes up with the right ideas. And it's not just on the 14th floor of headquarters. You want that cop in the street to be able to basically take his creativity, his or her ideas, and find a way to be able to apply them, and then we can all learn from them. Okay?
Will you be updating your 1998 book? And if you are, would you be including any remarks about the current administration as Bill Kelly did in his book?
I have a second book that came out a few years ago called Collaborate or Perish. It was written with Zach Tuman, current Deputy Commissioner of the NYPD. Zach helped to write many of the case studies at Harvard on dealing with issues. So the book is about 22 case studies of successful collaborations and some that didn't work. And the idea being that if you're going to succeed, you're going to have to collaborate. And an area of collaboration I feel very good about in this city is you are not going to find a single law enforcement agency in this region that is going to have a negative thing to say about the NYPD and the willingness to work collaboratively with them. I defy you to find any agency, FBI, CIA, DEA, the various surrounding police departments, Port Authority, that don't feel that they have an opportunity to work closely with this organization. You saw that in evidence on the Saturday bombing 3 weeks ago. That thing was solved within 24 hours because FBI, ATF, NYPD, all the agencies came together very quickly, worked together, and within 24 hours solved that problem. So the book, the theme, Collaborate or Perish. Turnaround was about the idea of what had happened in the 70s and 80s, and the turnaround, how we did it in the 90s. Collaborate or Perish, more recently published, was about the further learning that the most successful successes come about through collaboration. I have a new book that basically signed with one of the publishing companies. It'll be out probably within the next year. And that one is reflective of the times we live in today, and the working title of it right now is Contagion of Fear. Everybody in this country, literally everybody in the world right now, is fearful. We're all fearful of the coming election in terms of the uncertainty that, seriously, think of it, I've been around a long time. I've never seen an election in my 50-some-odd years of being able to vote that I've seen so much fear of the unknown because we have such diametrically opposed candidates. But the fear of Zika, fear of what the Russians are up to, the world right now is embraced with fear. And the theme is the idea that same way we dealt with fear in the 70s in Boston when I go into those neighborhoods, it wasn't the fear of serious crime, it was the fear of the quality of life issue and how to address that so that you want to have people aware, see something, say something, but not live in fear. And so the idea is that you can effectively deal with fear to such an extent that you keep an awareness, but it doesn't become so overwhelming that it just destroys our lives. So there's a second book, Collaborate or Perish. I think it's still out there. And then there'll be a new one in about a year. And it really is the evolution of thinking over now almost 50 years. Thank you. Okay. We have two people standing, so we'll finish with these two questions if we may, okay? Thank you, sir.
A resource of the NYPD that you didn't have occasion to mention today are the more than 4,000 volunteer auxiliary police officers who are trained, uniformed, and equipped by the police department to supplement the regular paid force. You did mention them briefly before a joint meeting of several New York State Senate committees when you mentioned that you thought that penalties for assaulting auxiliary police officers should be enhanced. Can you comment on that? Because the press didn't report your remarks beyond the fact that you mentioned it.
Well, actually not specific to auxiliary police officers who, unlike full-time police officers, are not armed other than the baton they carry. that I'm very supportive of the increasing of penalties for assaulting police officers in the performance of their duties. As recently as Monday, Commissioner O'Neill was talking about, in the face of a lot of good news, crime down, stops down, that assaults against police are up. And so much of, unfortunately, what we see with the fusion of videos that are now out there is in almost every instance in those videos, I won't say almost every instance, but I would argue in the majority of instances, what we're seeing on video is oftentimes people resisting arrest. And we have an expression, it's lawful, but it looks awful. And it is not easy to overcome somebody who's resisting. I talk about in the book Turnaround that myself and Jack Crowley, just out of the academy, back, I was probably 25 years old at that time, very good physical shape. Jack was 6'2", just looked like Superman. And we went into a house on a Friday night, family in there. The grandfather had been, nowadays would probably describe it as dementia, but back then his erratic behavior was just unsettling. That's why we'd been called. He was destroying the house. And I'll tell you, in all my years of policing, I've never had a tougher arrest than the two of us trying to arrest this 75-year-old guy. You couldn't get him under control. And so I have a great, when I look at the videos, when I look at the use of force, again, I'm informed by my own experiences, understanding how difficult it is to make an arrest. So where I am supportive of the idea of if you assault a police officer or injure a police officer during the course of the lawful performance of his duties, there should be a penalty for that, appropriate to that. And in some instances, I think the courts in particular don't take serious enough account of the difficulty. I think that's where we're going to be aided by the videos, the increasing videos, because they, as you know, they don't tell the whole story oftentimes, but they give us more to work with. And I think over time that we're going to see that beneficial. I'd also point out, though, speaking about this and assaults in police or police apparently assaulting citizens, that we're a city of 8.5 million people. There are many advocacy groups that are out there continually seeking to show police misbehaving. Those 8.5 million people, probably 8.25 of them are carrying a camera. And in the average year, the 3 years I've been commissioner, I don't think in the course of a year, despite a lot of people looking to catch police behaving inappropriately, I don't think we've ever had a year where there have been more than two dozen videos that have been given to CCRB or turned over to the police or more often given to the media. And in many of those instances, when you look into it, what looks awful is in fact lawful according to policies, procedures, and laws. So the issue of cameras, the issue of body cameras on police, New York has been going slowly in that area. I think that's appropriate because it is a profound new tool, and we want to make sure before you put 20,000 of those things out there that we understand what the guidelines are, what the policies are, what the training should be, and the limitations that, because right now I think a lot of people think they're the panacea. They are not. They are going to be useful, but they are not a panacea. Okay, thank you. Last question.
I have 2 points, Willie B. A, if you get reappointed to re-oversee the NYCPD, you should tell the cops to refrain from telling people where to stand on parade day, meaning if I choose to watch the Manhattan Border Parade, I don't expect them to approach me and say, you can't stand here as long as I'm standing in an unfrozen zone. That was my understanding. Okay? And B, just in case you didn't know, broken windows has got to go.
I'm sorry, what was the second part? I didn't
The
hear it.
second point, my second point is, just in case you didn't know, broken windows has got to go. Several protesters mentioned that to you at City Hall, which became the bingo hall from home to ECW over 1 year ago.
Okay.
And nothing has changed since then.
All right. In terms of the first comment, no fear of me being reappointed, that I'm done. I've had a great 46 years, 49 if you include the 3 years in the military police. And I think I've done my bit, that I'm going to leave it now for a little younger generation. And I think hopefully my legacy for this city is that over time that, did a lot of good things, some other things that are still troubling, but that the principal legacy will be, I think, leaving the department in the hands of leadership that is committed to, I think, what all the various groups in this city want, no matter where they come from, which is that they want to thrive in a democracy, they want to thrive in a safe city. And the leadership that's there, Commissioner O'Neill, Chief Gomez, Ben Tucker, that down to the precinct level, and increasingly, hopefully, with better trained police officers and better focused police officers, that we'll see the continuation of the last 25 years of steady crime decline, but we'll also see an increase in support of those police as they effectively are put in a position where they can truly practice community policing or neighborhood policing, as it's appropriately called in the city. That's not just my hope, that's my expectation. And I'm choosing to stay living in this city. I love the place. I'm Boston born and bred. Spent a lot of time in Los Angeles, but this is where I want to be. And one of the reasons I want to be here is this is the city that I can feel very safe riding the subways, walking the streets, and same for my wife, and that it's a great, great city, and in many respects, the best is still yet to come, and I truly believe that. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for being here this morning.
Thank you. Stay right here. Thank you. I hope you feel as honored as I do. I think in some ways we heard a valedictory just three weeks after you left office. It was really a memorable morning, a terrific talk, lots of things to think about. Maybe we'll try and publish it. I hope that you'll think about that. As we always do, we like to present part of this, something from the scholarship of the law school, and this is one of the latest issues of our law review, and it's on human trafficking, another major issue. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you so much for today.
Thank you.